the top. Many of you have been sat here in this room with me where I've spoken about global Trumpism and various things like this. The first time I came out publicly and said I thought that he would win was at a Watson event in May last year. I did an interview in Greece that went viral when I predicted both Brexit and Trump. And it's not because I have a clairvoyant crystal ball sitting under my bed or I made a pact with Satan to see the future in a mirror. It's simply, it's pretty obvious if you think about it in a more global way. This is not a local event. Everything that Professor Shillett just said is true about this election, but Brexit happened. There's a left-wing version of this that brought us Greece. There's the shrinkage of centre-party votes across the entire OECD. There's the collapse of left-wing parties' votes in particular across Western Europe. Coming up next, Renzi is going to fail in Italy in the referendum that's coming up, which will cause a constitutional crisis in Italy. Shortly after that, we have the French election coming up. I would like to remind you of the following statistics. The lowest George Bush ever got, George Bush Jr. got as president in his approval rating was 29%. The president of France currently has an approval rating of 4%. And the National Front have nearly 40% of the intended vote. So even with the design of the French constitution, which makes it very difficult and you have to have a second round, etc., the most popular political party by a factor of 2 in France is the National Front. After that, we have the German elections coming up. Merkel is vulnerable. How is all of this going to play out, and what is it all connected? Here's a simple way of thinking about it. From 1945 until 1975, we targeted a particular economic variable called full employment. And there's a thing called the Lucas critique, which basically says if you keep targeting something, people will game it. And they did. Unions gamed it, employers gamed it, and the result was inflation. And after a while, that inflation became painful enough for the people who were hurt by it, who were the creditor classes in these countries, to band together and fund a market-friendly revolution. And they liberated finance, and they deregulated banks, and they integrated the economies of the world. And they globalized labour such that labour could no longer demand that it gets its share of productivity, because if you don't, I'll just move your job somewhere else. And all of those trade agreements that were signed, the globalization, which is inevitable and we can't roll back. You know, you can go on the web and type in WTO text, and you'll find that it's a very long 700-page legal agreement that took 5 years to thrash out, between corporate interests, lawyers, lobbyists, with very little input from civil society. The same is true of the EU's agreements on capital movements, the banking union, take your pick. And there's a moment when people just began to figure out that for the past 30 years, going from 1985 until now, huge amounts of money have been generated in the global economy, and as we know from the work of Thomas Piketty and others, most of it's gone up to a tiny fraction of the population. So there's been a huge amount of growth, but hardly anyone's benefited. You don't have to go far to see this. Get off the east side. Go to the west side of Providence. Go to northwest Providence and walk into neighbourhoods which have cheque cashing agencies, fried chicken joints, pawn shops, broken down fix your mobile and networks you've never heard of stores. That's the reality for people, not just here, in many, many countries. So they're a bit fed up with this. And they've decided at any possible opportunity, whether it's Brexit, the Italian constitutional referendum or anything, to basically give their elites notice that we've had enough of this. And that's what this is. Now, there's a macroeconomic underpinning to this one too, because after we decided to target full employment for 30 years, we decided to target inflation for 30 years. I don't see why the Lucas critique doesn't actually apply to that one as well. And managed to create a world in which you can dump 13 trillion euros into the global money supply through quantitative easing and other programs, and there's no inflation anywhere. And here's your problem. When you've levered up your banking system and bailed it out, dumped it on the public purse and said you need to cut that terrible debt, when people's personal balance sheets are still bloated from all the credit they took on in the 2000s, and they don't have wage growth and there's no inflation to ease the burden of the debt, then the creditors fight harder to get their money back. Whether it's the case of Germany versus the rest of the Eurozone, whether it's the form of the creditor class versus the debtor class, what we have everywhere are creditor-debtor standoffs. And those creditor-debtor standoffs take different forms. For the left, it takes the form of Podemos. For the right, it takes the form of the National Front. And for Trump, which has a weird coalition, which is of course sexist and of course racist and of course anti-immigrant and all the rest of it. But one part of it is, if you look at the states that really fell hard, the Rust Belt, it's economic. Now, if you recognise that simple fact, you can put Trump in there with Brexit, you can put Trump in there with Jeremy Corbyn, you can put him in with all the rest of it. And I'll leave you one set of numbers that I found today, which I think is just an absolute clanger for this whole thing. In 2015, Wall Street bonuses, not regular compensation, bonuses, 7 years after they were bailed out with the public purse, totaled, when I get this right, $28.4 billion. Total compensation paid to every single person in this country who earns a minimum wage, $14 billion. I'll stop there.